There's a reason a quiet room can feel strangely uncomfortable now. Not peaceful, not relaxing, uncomfortable. You would think silence would feel like relief, but for a lot of people, silence feels like withdrawal. And that should bother you, because it means your nervous system may no longer be calibrated to peace. It may be calibrated to noise, to interruption, to low-level urgency, to the constant feeling that something is happening somewhere and you need to know about it. So that's the topic. Not productivity, not discipline, not some boring put your phone away lecture. You see, the problem is that your brain may have learned to crave chaos. And if that is true, then a lot of what you call your personality right now may actually be an environment problem. You are not necessarily bad at focus. You are not necessarily weak. You are not necessarily lazy. You may just be adapting to a system that trains your brain to expect constant stimulation and then punishes you when peace feels unnatural. And that is where systems thinking becomes useful, because most people try to solve this at the level of willpower. They think the problem is personal weakness. They think the answer is be more disciplined. But if the system around you is generating the state inside you, then discipline alone is not enough. You have to see the machine. Your brain did not evolve for this. Not for infinite scroll, not for 20 open tabs, not for news from 5 continents before breakfast, not for group texts, email, headlines, dopamine slots, algorithmic bait, and the low-grade pressure of being reachable at all times. Your nervous system evolved in a world where changes in the environment often meant something important. A sound in the bushes mattered. A sudden movement mattered. A shift in the tribe mattered. Status mattered. Threats mattered. Novelty mattered. And now that same biology is being hit all day by things that initiate importance. A ping, a red flag, a vibration, a headline, a message preview, a recommendation, a number next to a heart icon. And your body reacts as if the environment changed in a meaningful way. Because in one sense it did. Not biologically meaningful, but psychologically meaningful, socially meaningful, emotionally meaningful, and over time that matters because attention is not just something you use, attention is something that shapes you. What you repeatedly attend to starts to become the architecture of your inner life. So if your attention is repeatedly captured by noise, urgency, outrage, novelty, and interruption, then eventually your inner life begins to resemble those things. Noisy, urgent, reactive, fragmented. People say they want peace. They say they want rest. They say they want a simpler life. And then they get 10 seconds of stillness and reach for the phone like a diver reaching for oxygen. Why? Because the brain can get conditioned not just to stimulation, but to a certain rhythm of stimulation. Tiny reward, tiny threat, tiny update, tiny social check, tiny uncertainty, tiny release. Over and over and over. And after enough repetitions, chaos stops feeling chaotic. It starts feeling normal, expected, even weirdly comforting, because at least it feels like something is happening. At least it feels like you are plugged in. At least it feels like you are in motion. And that is one of the strangest tricks of modern life. People become attached to the very thing that is exhausting them. They say they want less chaos, but when chaos disappears, they feel flat, or bored, or vaguely anxious. Because peace now feels like an absence rather than a presence. And that is when you know the calibration has changed. That is when you know the system got inside. But there's a loop here that I think quietly ruins a lot of adult life. The more reactive your environment becomes, the more your day gets organized around what is urgent. Messages, replies, notifications, logistics, fires. Tiny little things that light up and demand response. And the more your day gets organized around urgent little things, the less space remains for important, deep things. Reflection, strategy, reading, writing, thinking, long conversations, meaningful work. And when those deep things get crowded out, something starts to happen internally. You begin to feel busy, but not fulfilled. Full, but not directed. Active, but not alive. So then anxiety starts creeping in. Because somewhere in you, you know the day got consumed without being meaningful. And once that anxiety shows up, what do most people do? They go back to the quick tasks, because quick tasks feel doable. Quick tasks give immediate closure. quick tasks create the illusion of control. So the lack of meaning pushes you back towards urgency, and urgency pushes you even farther away from meaning. That is a loop, a real one. And if you do not see it as a loop, you will probably just blame yourself. You'll say, I have a focus problem. But it may not be a focus problem. It may just be the system that you're in. Most people do not snap dramatically. They erode gradually. One more app, one more demand, one more feed, one more thing to keep track of, one more identity to maintain, one more digital doorway into everyone else's thoughts. That is how modern overload usually works, by inches. And because it happens incrementally, people normalize it. The baseline shifts. What would have felt insane 10 years ago now just feels like a Tuesday. And because it feels normal, people stop diagnosing the environment. They start diagnosing themselves. Why am I so tired? Why can't I think straight? Why do I feel so mentally cluttered? Why do I avoid silence? Why do I keep checking things that do not matter? Why am I exhausted after doing almost nothing physical? Because mental fragmentation is exhausting. Context switching is exhausting. Low-grade vigilance is exhausting. Living in an atmosphere of constant relevance signaling is exhausting. And one of the great tricks of this age is that people confuse mental occupation with real living. They think because their mind is full, their life must be full. They are not the same thing. This is where systems thinking helps. It becomes a survival tool because most people ask the wrong first question. They ask, why am I like this? That question sounds honest, but it is often too small. A better question is, what system reliably produces this state in me? What inputs keep showing up? What triggers what? What reinforcements are built in? What gets rewarded? What gets interrupted? What gets crowded out? That is systems thinking. Not looking at isolated events, looking at patterns. Not looking at single moments, looking at structure. Not obsessing over symptoms, but tracing the architecture that keeps producing the symptom. And that matters because once you move from shame to pattern recognition, something changes. You stop moralizing your struggle. You stop acting like every recurring problem is a character defect. And you start looking for leverage points, not just effort, leverage. That is a big difference. If the room keeps flooding, you can keep mopping, or you can find the leak. Most people are mopping their minds all day long. Very few are looking for the leaks. This is where it gets darker. If you stay long enough inside a bad system, eventually it starts becoming your identity. You stop saying, I am in a distracting environment. You start saying, I am a distracted person. You stop saying, my inputs are chaotic. You start saying, I have an anxious mind. You stop saying, my attention is being fragmented. You start saying, I am just not good at deep work. That's how the environment disappears. By hiding inside self-deception. And then once that happens, the system wins twice. It affects your state, then it convinces you the state is you. That's why this phrase is important, cognitive sovereignty. Because if you do not have some control over what gets to shape your mind, then eventually your mind starts becoming a reflection of whatever was loudest around it. And then peace becomes to feel foreign, not because peace is unnatural, but because reactivity became home. And then there's another layer here. Chaos is not just accidental. It is profitable. A calm person is hard to bait. A centered person is hard to hook. A person who is not constantly scanning for novelty, threat, validation, or stimulation is much harder to capture. But a person whose nervous system is slightly agitated, that person clicks. That person checks. That person scrolls. That person returns. So a lot of modern systems have learned something very simple. The best way to keep attention is not always to satisfy it. It is to keep it slightly unresolved, slightly provoked, slightly uncertain, slightly stimulated, just enough tension to keep the loop alive. And that means some of what feels personal is not personal at all. Some of it is structural. Some of it is engineered. Not in a cartoon villain way, in a systems way. If a platform benefits when you stay reactive, it will tend to produce reactivity. If an attention economy profits when you remain interrupted, it will tend to reward interruption. That is not paranoia. That is incentive logic. Here is another way to see it. Most of the things stressing you are not experienced as one big thing. They arrive as fragments, a message here, a headline there, an email, a feed, a reminder, a comparison hit, a little ambient guilt, an unfinished task, a tiny social uncertainty. Each one seems small, but they funnel downward into the same output: reactivity, shorter attention, shallower work, lower frustration tolerance, more checking, more mental residue, less depth, less intention, and less peace. That's why people often think they have 10 different problems. They do not. They often have one funnel, multiple inputs, one downstream condition. And if you can see the funnel, you can stop getting hypnotized by every separate trigger. You start recognizing the pattern they all serve. This is the part that matters most. If the system is producing the state, then peace cannot just be a feeling you wait for. It has to become a design choice, not just, I should be calmer. No. What is the structure that makes calm more likely? What needs more friction? What needs less friction? What needs to be farther away? What needs to be turned off? What needs to be a boundary? What needs to be a rule? And what needs a different place in the room? Because the truth is, a lot of people are trying to fight well-designed machines with vague good intentions. That will not work. You need design. Friction beats fantasy. Turning off notification beats hoping you will resist them. Putting distance between you and the trigger beats promising to be more disciplined next week. Creating screen-free zones beats trying to be mindful in a room full of digital bait. Structure is mercy, especially when the surrounding system was built to erode it. And the beautiful part is, when the environment changes, the mind often follows faster than people expect. Not because you became a new person overnight, but because the loop changed. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but believe it, inner peace is not soft anymore. Not in this environment. It is resistance. To reclaim attention is resistance. To create silence is resistance. To become less baitable is resistance. To stop letting outrage, novelty, and interruption vote on your inner state all day long is resistance. And maybe that is the deeper point. Your brain does not crave chaos because chaos is your true nature. It may crave chaos because chaos became the rhythm it adapted to. But adaptation can go both ways. You adapted once, you can adapt again. Toward depth, toward stillness, toward a life where your attention is not constantly being recruited by whatever screams the loudest. That's the hope in all of this. You do not have to become a monk. You do not have to disappear into the woods. You just have to start seeing the system clearly enough so that you stop confusing its output for your identity. Your brain may have learned chaos. That does not mean chaos is what you are. And at the moment you really understand that, peace stops looking weak. It starts looking powerful. Because now it is not passivity. It is design. It is agency. Now it is sovereignty. And that may be one of the most important things to recover in modern life.